he's bringing them along to model the micro as he pursues the macro. He's multiplying his efforts. The most effective way to do that is by practicing the micro with others so that you can reach the macro through multiplication. Jesus is stewarding his mission. And he's stewarding both by doing that. He's stewarding the micro and the macro.
Today, Chuck Wood is going to join us and visit in with this conversation that Dave and I have been digging into. I don't know, but basically, since we've done this podcast, we've been talking about how do we use the term muddy boots, we've used micro, macro, but this idea of how do you live this stuff out and then catalyze and help other people to do it. And Chuck and Dave and I were texting about this, and it was like, man, we should just jump on a podcast and talk about it. So, Chuck, welcome.
Yeah, it's good to be with you guys. When I listened to the podcast, I was getting excited because I was running it through the Jesus filter and I was asking myself, did Jesus ever struggle or maybe he didn't struggle, but did he live in the tension between micro and macro? I was like, yes, of course he did. And so I started thinking of examples and got me real excited to think about those things. So,
Well, we're yeah,
Well,
we're
if
excited to dig in and talk on that. On just learning from what you're processing with Jesus. As I was preparing for this, and we were even chatting, getting ready for it. I'm just feeling the tension even this week in our living situation here in New York as we're experiencing just bug challenge in our apartment right now, and trying to figure out how do we live in the middle of that while we're also trying to think beyond just ourselves, macro, and see something happen on a larger scale. And it's messy and it's uncomfortable, and we need we need a model. And Chuck, what you're bringing in is the best model for us to turn to. And so excited to dig into this with you.
yeah, I try to use the Jesus filter. I've been trying to practice this discipline for the last 20 years now, and it is a discipline. Think Jesus first. And so when I heard the micro, macro, the first story that came to my mind was Jesus as a 12-year-old boy on his way to Jerusalem. You know, it's basically 80 miles, I think, from Nazareth or from Capernaum. He was coming from Nazareth. So let's say 50 miles of dirt roads, no gas stations, no Holiday Inn, and just the sweat and the dirt, and here's God in the flesh as a 12-year-old boy dealing with the micro. And I'm blown away by that actually. And then we progress in the story, and Jesus is hanging out with the religious leaders, asking questions and being asked questions. And he's about his father's business. And he's so focused on that, he doesn't even uh, he I'm sure he thought about it, but he he's not wrestling with the fact that his folks are pulling their hair out looking for him. He's on track. He's in the macro of the moment, uh, preparing for the future. He's investing in his mission. So the two come together, and it causes not only tension within him, but it creates tension with the relationships with his parents. So that was the first example that I thought of as you guys were talking.
It makes me wonder too, Chuck, as you're kind of bringing that up, and you made that little statement that he was living in the macro in the moment, and just in that little example, the way that you're collapsing all of it into one moment. And I'll never forget, for those of you guys who haven't met or heard of or been influenced by Chuck Wood, go get influenced by Chuck Wood. But he's been super helpful in Mark and I's life just over the years. And I remember the first training I ever went to that you were one of the trainers, and you took the little four fields illustration, and you're like, how does this happen? And you're like, it's not, first we go into the empty field, then gospel, then discipleship, and you crumpled it all up, and you're like, it all happens at the same time. And this micro macro tension of how the Father's like eternal purposes are happening in the moment that Jesus is sitting here talking with the Pharisees, right? And when we're bringing that eternal moment, that eternal perspective, that huge, here's what the Father is up to, and we get focused on it in that micro moment, it creates tension, which is part of the reason why Mark and I were like, hey, let's talk to Chuck about this, because that tension is real because of that moment when we're bringing the eternal into that mundane moment, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, the other observation I would make about what you just shared as a first example, Chuck, is that both of those fathers, his earthly parents, and then the heavenly Father that he's honoring and learning how to live out that micro mundane, and then the macro, it comes down to his identity, that he's learning how to obey and live out. He's got a just a normal day-to-day life to live into, and I'm sure came with a lot of just very ordinary challenges, in misunderstanding, in getting tired, in lots of just normal challenges of daily life, that to have a vision macro, which of course he did, he's God, but then living in our situation in human flesh, that's a tension right there, to live in both those identities. That's what jumped out to me, is it was an identity piece to live in the micro and the macro for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about it before the podcast. The micro is oftentimes the mundane. It's the nugging it out. It's nugging out life, and it's nugging out ministry. It's just one step at a time. It's the dirty, it's the changing diapers, it's, you know, uh, talking to somebody that you're mentoring for the 40th time. You really need to be in the Word of God. You need to read it for yourself. That's the micro, that's the mundane. And sometimes we just get tired of that. But the the macro is kind of like chasing rainbows and unicorns. It's way out there in the future, and it's big stuff, it's exciting stuff, but you can lose yourself in that as well by when is this going to happen? You can be disappointed or disillusioned. So anyways, it's hard. Both of them are hard as you think about putting them together, but Jesus did it, so we should follow his example.
Yeah, and one other observation I'll make there, you said this as well before we hit record, but to live out that identity and follow that example, to use the Jesus filter, it requires faith, for both of those, whether it's micro or macro, or to live in the tension of the two, is what we're talking about today, because you're as you're in that micro and you're living out your identity, there's a whole lot of things that are telling you that that's not who you are, or challenging that faithfulness to be obedient in the micro. And then as you're trying to be faithful with a vision that God has given. Jesus was trying to be faithful to his heavenly Father. There's a whole lot of things. Enter the enemy in coming to tempt Jesus. There's a whole lot of things that are coming against that identity as well, and so that required faith as well. So that I think was a helpful piece to bring in to live it out. Either way, or living in the tension of both, is a faith pursuit.
So the second example that I thought of was Jesus's ministry in Capernaum. When he first started, he's in the synagogue teaching. He's doing mundane stuff like casting out demons and healing people. And, it's just, but that is the everyday work. And if you were to really give that some thought, what if your life consisted of day in, day out, casting out demons, healing people, teaching, crowds pressing in? And that was your life. That would be the mundane. But that's the micro. And so Jesus is working all day, heals Peter's mother-in-law of a fever, and the whole city or town, village, gathers at the door. And this goes late into the night, and Jesus is just doing the hard work of ministry. But the next morning, before the crack of dawn, he's out there praying by himself, and everybody's looking for him. And Peter comes up, "Hey, everybody's looking for you. They're standing in the sick call line waiting to be healed." And Jesus says, "Let us go to the towns nearby so that I may preach there as well." And all of a sudden, the macro comes into focus for, Jesus had that, but for his men, they're invited to keep the mission going, for him to catalyze the gospel of the kingdom and press it into the countryside. He could have had, for all practical purposes, he had a megachurch. Most of us would have said, "We have arrived, we're good," but not Jesus. He realizes his purpose, and he is able to disconnect from the micro of the moment in order to pursue the macro of the future.
Yeah, that's not an easy one to do, Chuck. It's like a perfect example. Um, but I'll give you an example. Like if the platform that I'm using in Oklahoma City is the business that we're doing, sometimes the day-to-day whirlwind needs of the business can just drive everything that you're doing. And then whenever the kingdom wants to break in, or an opportunity for what's eternal comes at a time whenever the day-to-day tasks are overwhelming, you almost get to the place to where you lose the entire macro focus of the moment, and you just want to shove that intrusion out, right? Like you're tired, or you're busy. There's pressing needs. The crowd, the people, they need this, they need that. And the fact that Jesus has the ability to go, at all times, I'm going to meet the needs of the moment, but at the same time, holding in tandem his purpose and what the Father wants him to do. And through prayer, listening to the Father and saying, "Nope, it's time to go to the next towns." And being okay with, because the gospel writers don't really tell us what the townspeople said about him whenever he moved on. Like, they don't have the conversations. They don't put the Facebook reviews and the Google reviews up, right, of what happened when that mattered. But I can only imagine that it wasn't exactly well received, probably by the townspeople. And some of his disciples were probably even like, is this guy crazy? Like, what is he doing? It probably didn't make a whole lot of sense in that moment, you know? And that's something that sets up attention for me personally, is when what the macro is requiring of you doesn't make sense to the people around you, it's really hard to just keep doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you going to please people or are
Right.
you going to please God? And I think we all struggle with that one.
Now that is a tension right there. And living this way, Mark, is like intentionally setting up that tension. It's like you and I are talking about, we want to live our lives in such a way that we're putting ourselves in the position that we're constantly saying, do I want to please God or please people, and having to make that decision. I think there's a reason that people probably avoid that most often as they can.
Definitely, there's a reason why people avoid that. And I think I'd like to set you up for this, Chuck. There's a couple of pieces. I'll say one, and then I think there's another one in there that you're drawing out. But there's a connection with the first story you shared that I see, in that here again, he's exercising that muscle. He's getting away with the Father to hear what is the Father leading him to do, and so he's staying connected to the macro piece that he's called to do through that place of prayer and joining God where he's at work. I always call that the John 5:19 principle, where is the Father at work and then Jesus is joining him in that. So there's that piece for sure, but there's another piece here that you always bring out, that there's a phrase in there that I think you very intentionally highlight when Jesus is praying. Can you set us up with that? What is that connecting point between the micro and the macro there?
Yeah. Let us, is that what you're talking about?
Yep,
Yeah.
that's it.
Let us go to the towns nearby. So the fact that he's bringing along the people that he's mentoring, his disciples, his future leadership base, he's bringing them along to model the micro as he pursues the macro. And basically, what he's doing is he's multiplying his efforts. And anytime we're gonna, anytime we live in that tension, that's the most effective way to do that is by practicing the micro with others so that you can reach the macro through multiplication. Jesus is stewarding his mission, and he's stewarding both by doing that. He's stewarding the micro and the macro.
Mark, you and I were talking about this just a couple of podcasts ago, that if we don't if we don't have a conviction for multiplication, that tension goes away. It's that desire for multiplication that creates this tension, right? That
Yeah.
Chuck, you're bringing out here, because Jesus is going, I'm not going to be the one who's going to be the boots on the ground to the ends of the earth. These leaders are going to be the ones who are going to be the boots on the ground to the end of the earth. And I've got to multiply what they're supposed to be doing into their lives. But if I think I can do everything, this tension goes away, right? Or if I don't think I can do anything, this tension also goes away.
Or
Yeah.
Dave, this is the point you brought in a couple times ago when we were talking about this. I think it's so much more comfortable to land in the place of addition than it is in the place of multiplication. And I think the way that I see that playing out, as we're trying to apply, what do we see in this life of Jesus? How do we do this micro macro tension? A lot of the time, we talked about this in a couple episodes on the podcast, of the ultimate trajectory of the macro is you end up managing other people's work. The ultimate trajectory of the micro is you might end up being an evangelist. Jesus could have just set up camp and been the evangelist. But we could also end up in this place where instead of doing the messy work, and this is where what I hear what you saying, Dave, instead of doing the messy work that's honestly just really crazy hard to actually get in the lives of others and model to them the work that you're calling to multiply. This is what Chuck is framing up. The connection between the two is that multiplication into the life of others. And that's not that he just said that in a short phrase, but I mean that as Chuck could unpack, like that's a huge messy reality to connect those two together. And a lot of people don't want to do it. So they'll either end up in the micro edition of I'll just do the evangelistic work and share and do the ministry and cast out demons. Jesus could have set up shop, right? Or they'll do the macro edition of, well, I'll just go around and find guys that have already reached this level of maturity and I'll recruit them to the team and I'll just multiply it that way by actually just adding on already competent guys. But Jesus, he multiplied it by living in both and repeating the same thing to these guys over and over again. They didn't get it. And calling them to go with him. They misunderstand the mission. And so that's what I hear coming out of what you're saying, Dave, that I'd love for you to lean into a little bit more, Chuck, in this of that's actually really messy to connect the micro and the macro the way that Jesus did.
Yeah, the old saying, if you want something done right, do it yourself. Jesus doesn't believe in that. God doesn't believe in that, you know. He is inviting us into the greatest enterprise in all the universe of multiplying his image bearers. And he invites us and gives us not only the privilege, but the responsibility to participate with him in that. And, you know, it is super messy. One of the hardest things to teach leaders to do is to delegate. That's two things. Take the initiative and delegate. And to me, the reason why those are hard is because they're not doing it the way I would do it. You know, how many times did the disciples do it exactly the way Jesus did it? You know, they stumbled, they failed. And it's like you said, Mark, it's super messy. But in the end, you are stewarding what God has given you. And you're multiplying his mission, his glory.
The whole concept of people over task is, I think, really hard for Westerners to deal with, right? Because what you're talking about, Chuck, is we're developing people who are going to be with us, and then they're going to multiply the kingdom into other lives. And I had this group of 20 somethings just last night. We did the coaching circle, an iron on iron coaching circle with them. And the number one barrier that they wanted to discuss, as I've got them from 20 years old up to 32 years old, right? All of them wanted to talk about how do you get people to commit? That was the number one thing that they wanted to talk about, whether it was in their business or whether it was in a Bible study group or whether it was in their own families. But they were saying, or even in their own, like in their own marriages and wanting to do certain things. Or one of the young men that's dating a lady is like wanting to move towards marriage, and he doesn't know if she wants to move towards marriage. And he's asking the same question, like, how do I get people to commit? And I think that's part of the reason why addition, Mark, is so much easier, is because we can just put a task out there. We can get a whole bunch of people to just go do it the way that we want them to do it. And it's easy to draw the line and get commitment, but to say, are you in? Are you going to own this yourself? And are you going to become a steward, like you said, Chuck, that has that initiative that now you're driven by your own convictions? That is a lot of work, and it's slow. Like, it is slow progress sometimes.
Yeah, Dave, that goes back to what you said in the initial podcast. This is all tied into your identity and purpose. Now, I never separate those two. They're like a grilled cheese sandwich. Once you grill it, if you try to pull it apart, you only have a mess. So identity and purpose go together. You look at Jesus, he was driven by his identity and purpose. And so you want people to commit to the Great Commission, help them understand their identity and purpose. And if, we've been fighting our identity, that God-given identity, since the garden. That was the temptation. You can be God. You know, we weren't satisfied with our God-given identity, so we're constantly fighting against that. But once I embrace that, once I see the riches and the treasures of God-given identity and purpose, commitment isn't even an issue. Of course, I'm going to do that. I'll sell everything I have to buy that field with the treasure in it.
That, to your point, is what drove Jesus in that example, Chuck, that second example that you gave, that everyone else had a great plan for his ministry, right? But he had to know what he was called to do and to stay on task with that. So can you set us up? I know you had one more example. What was the last one you had?
Yeah, Jesus is on the cross. He's, you talk about micro, uh, all the pain and the suffering and the humiliation. I think of the hardest thing for me to hear about the whole, uh, the Sanhedrin and all those things, the beatings, the crucifixion. The hardest thing for me to hear is they spit on him. That just tears me up. You can't get any micro than that, They spit on God. And here he is, suffering, bleeding, dying. And there's a guy next to him who who earned the cross, you know, and he's asking Jesus, remember me when you enter into your kingdom. And Jesus is doing evangelism all the way up to the end, you know, with his almost last breath. Today, you will be with me in paradise. To me, that blows me away. Here's the Son of God. He's doing the macro. He's dying for the world and all its sin. And he's leading this guy to himself. He's leading a guy to Christ, the micro, you know. And then on top of that, he looks at John and his mom and he says, Mom, your son, and John, your mother. He's taking care of his mom. I would think I would have bigger fish to fry at that moment than, the compassion that we see Jesus having at the last moments of his life. And so here again, it's the micro and the macro in the very moment when it would have been toughest to keep both of those in tension at that very time.
I think I feel lost for words on this example, Chuck, because of just how much the Son of God went through in this connecting the micro and the macro in the cross. And in some ways it's relatable. I mean, there's all of the examples that you're giving to us today. There's a suffering piece, and this is the ultimate suffering. And so partly we can expect suffering in that reality of connecting those two together. But some of it's even beyond words. It's like that's amazing, and just it drives us to worship. I think the fact that Jesus connected the two.
Yeah, it blows me away. In fact, this example is proof positive that nobody held this tension together better than Jesus.
Chuck, what do you think is the connection? I'm doing a setup and you might look at me cross-eyed after I do it. And if so, you can go, Dave, that makes no sense. That's fine. But what do you think the connection is between identity and purpose in the sense that Jesus knew his role, but he also entrusted himself to what the Father was up to? And how do you think that micro macro tension really connects whenever we're going, there's certain things that the Father can do that I can't, but there's certain things that I can do that the Father has assigned to me, has entrusted to me, has given me responsibility for. And how do those two, when rightly aligned, help us to walk in this tension well? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mark alluded to John 5:19. The Son can do nothing of himself. He only does what he sees the Father doing, and he does it in like manner. So the Son is abiding so deeply and so richly with the Father that they're in complete alignment. And that is, I think, the ultimate example. If we're going to be like Jesus, we need to be like Jesus that way. That's the crescendo. That's the apex of becoming like Jesus. That we're so united with God, so aligned that we are in step with what He's saying and doing and thinking, you know. So to me, part of my identity and purpose comes from that alignment, that as I abide in Christ, and I'm not just talking about the word and prayer, I'm talking about every bit of abiding in Christ, obedience, sharing the gospel, faithfulness, honesty, and it goes on. That's what it means to abide in Christ, aligning myself with Him. As I do that, my identity and purpose becomes more and more clear because I'm actually living it out. I'm not just talking about it. I'm not just thinking about it. I'm doing it. I'm becoming more like Christ. And my identity and purpose become more clear, more focused, and and that's when I can live in the tension a lot better because I'm saying no to ridiculous stuff and I'm saying yes to God stuff, you know. So does that answer your question, Dave?
Well, yeah, and I never really thought about like Mark, even as we've chatted, John 15, I've never really thought of the vine and the branch as a micro macro illustration. But
Mm.
as you're talking, Chuck, I'm like, John 15 really is a perfect example of the macro is the vine. God is doing his work, and the micro is I'm the branch, and my job is to just do what my branch is supposed to do and bear the fruit that my branch is supposed to bear. And the only possible way I can do that is to stay constantly connected to the macro that the Father is up to. And so, um, I've never really, just being honest, Mark, I've never really thought about John 15 in that way. But Chuck, I'm tracking with you. Like, because I think some of the tension that gets created even in my own life is honestly when we see the macro and we see a lot of what God could do and we start casting vision and talking strategy and doing all those things, it is very easy for us to start to think that we can make the macro happen. And the real truth is that we actually can't make the macro happen, but we like to scamper after that. And I think we can make things happen in the micro because they're our responsibility, but it's so mundane that you're kind of like, I don't know if I necessarily want this responsibility to do these two things. And I think that connection of I can trust that if I'm doing what the Father wants me to do and bearing the fruit he wants me to bear in the mundane life, and it's constantly connected to the greater purpose and eternal things of God that he's doing, I know that he's going to knit those things together to do far greater than I could do on my own. Like it's going to be exponential beyond my ability.
Exactly. And, we're, like you mentioned, Dave, earlier, we're so Western, we're so individualistic, you know, uh, it's a we goal, not a me
Mm.
goal. And because I can, could Jesus have evangelized the world by himself? Absolutely. Can we? Absolutely not, you know. And so Jesus modeled for us what it would take to reach the world for him. And, if I want to get on the individualistic plane again, uh, I'm not going to experience the abundant life personally unless I get in alignment with my identity and purpose. And doing that together, you know, with other people, multiplying.
Truth bombs from Chuck. They're always in abundance when we talk to him, Mark.
Yep. I have one more thing I would love to hear from you, Chuck, but is there anything else you want to share as you land the plane with these and this is three examples from Jesus. So you basically gave us a homework assignment to put on the Jesus filter and go back and look for more. So I think that's great. You set this up for here's a few, but look for more. But is there anything you want to share to bring this home for the bottom line?
Yeah, I think the Jesus filter is an aim, is a discipline that we all need to tackle. Um, I have so much to say about this because I think it's so important. You know, if we miss Jesus, the only thing we missed was the boat. You know, uh, we have got to,
Everything.
yeah, we have got to train ourselves to think Jesus, to talk Jesus, and when I'm mentoring somebody, I'm consciously thinking, have I brought Jesus into this discussion and used him as the supreme example of whatever we're talking about, whether it's giving or it's, uh, resting? Have I brought Jesus into that discussion? And I call it a discipline because I don't think this comes naturally. I think we need to train ourselves to do that. And oh, by the way, we have an enemy that hates when you bring Jesus into the discussion. And so he's going to do everything that he can to derail any discussion about the king. So I've been thinking about this. We need to be the right person and find the right person to point them to the right person. I need to be everything that God designed me to be. I need to be the right person. I need to be conformed to the image of Christ. I need to look for people that want to do that, that I'm just one step ahead of them and I can help them take the next step towards becoming like Christ. There are so few people that want to do that. It's like finding a needle in a haystack, but finding the right person and then point them to the right person. I am not the right person to point to. Only Jesus is. So I've got to point them to Jesus. And that is true discipleship.
Well, I think you may have already just done what I was going to ask you to do at the last of this, Chuck, and that was to offer you a prophetic soapbox to North America right now. And I think maybe you just did that. But in our context in North America, that idea of micro and macro is real, as it is everywhere. And if we're going to see the kingdom come, first of all, the Father has got a plan. He's at work. But what does that look like? What do we need to hear? Is there anything else you want to share? What else do we need to hear as practitioners? We've got a lot of that kind of person who listens to this podcast. Is there anything else that we need to hear in pursuing Jesus in the micro macro tension?
Master the master. Here's the challenge. If you're not reading the Gospels daily, which is the clearest explanation of who Jesus is, then Jesus is probably not your top priority. I know that's super prophetic, it's offensive to some, but hey, get over it. Let's get to Jesus. Read the Gospels, a portion of the Gospels daily. Get to know Jesus and then follow him. I have a saying, you can't follow what you can't see. And the clearest way we see Jesus today is in the Gospels. So get in the Gospels, see him, follow him, become like him. And I have a sneaky suspicion. The more we become like Jesus, the more we will handle the micro and the macro with less tension. I think we'll handle it like Jesus did.
Thanks for listening, for watching. If this content has been helpful for you, please take a minute to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us to get this content out there farther, to serve Jesus, grow his kingdom, and accomplish the Great Commission until there is no place left. Much love to you guys. See you next time.